Hello, and this is Swanns part. I forget which part. I always forget which part. 37, 38. Starting on page 246. And stopping, gravely lifting his head, adopting a deep bass note, which he tried to make harmonious, he added, "And it's so sincere." Except at the moment when he had said, "stronger than the night watch," a blasphemy that had provoked a protest from Madame Verdurin, who considered the Night Watch the greatest masterpiece in the world, along with the Ninth and the Winged Victory, and at Made with Caca, which had caused Forcheville to cast a circular glance at the table to see if the word was acceptable, and had then brought to his mouth a prudish and conciliatory smile. All the guests, except for Swann, had fastened their eyes on the painter with the gazes hypnotized by admiration. "How he amuses me when he gets carried away like that," cried Madame Verdurin, when he was finished, delighted that the table was so interested, on the very day when Monsieur de Forcheville had come for the first time. "And what about you? What's the matter with you? Letting your mouth hang open like that, like some great dog?" She said to her husband, "You know very well how he can talk. It's as if my husband has never heard you before. If only you could have seen the way he looked while you were talking. He was lapping you up. And tomorrow he'll repeat everything you said without losing a word." "It's no joke," said the painter, enchanted with his success. "You seem to think I'm giving you a sales talk. You think it's all a sham. I'll take you there to see for yourself. Then you'll decide whether I'm exaggerating. I'll bet your boots you'll come back even more enthusiastic than I was." But we don't think you're exaggerating. We just want you to eat your dinner, and we want my husband to eat too. Monsieur, some more Sol Normand. You can see that his is cold. We're not in such a hurry as all that. You're serving as if the house were on fire. Now wait a little before you bring in the salad." Madame Cottard, who was modest and did not talk much, did not lack self-assurance when a happy inspiration caused her to hit upon a suitable remark. She felt that it would have some success. This gave her confidence, and what she did with it was not so much in order to shine as to be useful to her husband's career. And so she did not allow the word salad to escape after it was spoken by Madame Verdurin. "And that wouldn't be Japanese salad, would it?" she said softly, turning to Odette. And delighted and abashed by the appropriateness and boldness of making this allusion so discreet yet so clear to the new and astonishing play by Dumas, she burst into charming, ingenuous laughter, not very noisy, but so irresistible that for a few moments she could not control it. "Who is that lady? She's a lively one." "No, it's not. But we'll have some for you if We'll have some for you if if all y'all will come to dine with us on Friday." Whew. "I'm going to seem very provincial to you, monsieur," said Madame Cottard to Swann, "but I haven't yet seen the famous Francillon everyone's talking about. The doctor has already gone. I even recall he told me he had the very great pleasure of spending the evening with you, and I confess I didn't find it reasonable that he should pay for seats to go again with me. Obviously, at the Théâtre Français, one never regrets one's evening. It's always well acted, but as we have very nice friends." Madame Cottard rarely uttered a proper name and simply referred to some of our friends, or one of my friends, because it was more distinguished. Speaking in an artificial tone, and with the air of importance of a person who names only those she chooses to, who often have a box and are kind enough to take us all to the new productions that are worth going to. I'm certain to see Franquillion sooner or later, and then I can form an opinion for myself. Yet I must confess I am a bit embarrassed, for in every drawing-room I visit, naturally the only thing they're talking about is that wretched Japanese salad. One even begins to be a little tired of it, she added, seeing that Swann did not seem as interested as she would have thought in so burning a topic. I must admit, though, that it sometimes provides an excuse for rather amusing notions. For instance, I have a friend who's most original, though she's a very pretty woman, very popular, very sought after, who claims she got her cook to make that Japanese salad at her house, putting in everything that Alexandre Dumas fils mentions in the play. She invited some friends to come and eat it. Unfortunately, I wasn't one of the elect. But she told us about it at her next at home. Apparently it was quite horrible. She made us laugh until we cried. But you know, it's all in the way you tell it, she said, seeing that Swann still looked grave, and imagining that it was perhaps because he did not like Franquillion. Anyway, I think I'll be disappointed. I don't think it's as good as Serge Panine, which Madame de Crécy worships so. In that one, at least, there are deep things that make you think. But to give a recipe for a salad on the stage of the Théâtre Français, whereas Serge Panine, but then, it's like everything that comes from Georges Aulnay's pen. It's always so well written. I don't know if you know Le Maître de Forge, which I like even better than Serge Panine. Forgive me, said Swann to her with irony, but I confess that my lack of admiration is almost equally divided between the two masterpieces. Really, what have you got against them? Are you sure you aren't prejudiced? Do you think perhaps they're a little dreary? Anyway, as I always say, one should never argue about novels or plays. Everyone has his own way of looking at things, and what you find detestable may be the very thing I like best. She was interrupted by Forcheville, addressing Swann. In fact, while Madame Cottard was talking about Franquillion, Forcheville had told Madame Verrin how much he admired what he had called the painter's little speech. "The gentleman has a faculty for speaking, a memory," he had said to Madame Verrin when the painter was finished, "such as I have rarely encountered. By my bootlaces, I'd love to have such a gift. He would make an excellent preacher, one may say, with him. And Monsieur Brechot, you have two real characters, one as good as the other, though for gift of the jab, I am not even sure this one would not, in fact, ace the professor. It comes out more naturally, it's less studied, although now and then he does use words that are a bit more on the vulgar side. But that's the thing to do nowadays. It's not often that I've seen anyone hold the floor so cleverly, hold the spittoon, as we used to say in the regiment. And come to think of it, it was in the regiment that I had a friend the gentleman rather reminded me of. Apropos of anything, I don't know what, this glass, for instance, he could rattle on for hours. No, not about this glass, that's a silly thing to say, but about the Battle of Waterloo, anything you like. And he would throw in things you never would have thought of. Why, Swann was in the same regiment. He must have known him. "Do you see Monsieur Swann often?" asked Madame Verdurin. "Oh no," answered Monsieur de Forcheville, and since in order to approach Odette more easily he wanted to be pleasant to Swann, he attempted to seize the opportunity of flattering him by talking about his distinguished friends, but talking about them as a man of the world, in the tone of an affectionate critic, and not as though he were congratulating him on an unhoped-for success. "Isn't it so, Swann? I never see you. Anyway, how could I ever see him? The man is always hanging about with the La Tremoise. Tremoilles? And with the Lombs, people like that. An imputation especially false, since for a year now Swann had hardly gone anywhere but to the Verdurins. But the mere name of a person they did not know was greeted by a reproving silence on their part. Monsieur Verdurin, afraid of the painful impression that these names of bores, especially when tactfully hurled thus in the faces of the faithful, must have produced on his wife, secretly cast at her a glance full of worried solicitude. He saw then that in her resolution not to take action, not to have been affected by the news that had just been announced to her, not merely to remain dumb, but to have been deaf as well. The way we pretend to be deaf when a friend who has offended us tries to slip into the conversation an excuse which we would seem to accept if we listened to it without protest, or when someone utters in our presence the forbidden name of an ingrate. Madame Verdurin, so that her silence would not seem to be a form of consent, but rather ignorant silence of an inanimate object, had suddenly divested her face of all life, all mobility. Her prominent forehead was now merely a lovely study in the round, which the name of those La Tremoise, at whose house Swann was always hanging around, and had not been able to penetrate. Her slightly wrinkled nose revealed an indentation that seemed copied from life. Her half-open mouth seemed about to speak. She was now merely a lost wax, a plaster mask, a model for a monument, a bust for the Palais de l'Industrie, in front of which the public would certainly stop to admire the sculptor by expressing the indefeasible dignity of the Verdurins as opposed to that of the La Tremoise and the Lombs, whose equals they naturally were, as they were the equals of all the bores on earth, had managed to give an almost papal majesty to the whiteness and rigidity of the stone. But at last the marble came to life and insinuated that one could not be squeamish if one wanted to go to the homes of these people, because the wife was always drunk and the husband so ignorant that he said corridor instead of corridor. "You'd have to pay me handsomely before I'd let that sort enter my house," concluded Madame Verdurin, looking at Swann with an imperious air. She probably did not hope that he would be submissive enough to imitate the saintly simplicity of the pianist's aunt, who had just exclaimed, "You see that? What astonishes me is that there are still people who'll speak to them. I think I would be too afraid, once struck out of luck. How can there still be folks low enough to go running after them?" But he might have at least answered like Forcheville, "Lord, she's a duchess. Some people are still impressed by that," which had at least allowed Madame Verdurin to reply, much good may it do them." Instead of that, Swann merely laughed with an air that signified that he could not even take such extravagant nonsense seriously. Monsieur Verdurin, continuing to cast furtive glances at his wife, saw with sadness and understood all too well that she was feeling the rage of a Grand Inquisitor who cannot manage to extirpate the heresy, and in order to try to lead Swann to a recantation, since the courage of one's convictions always seems to be a calculation and an act of cowardice in the eyes of those who do not share them, Monsieur Verdurin challenged him. Now tell us frankly what you think of them. We won't repeat it to them. To which Swann answered, Why, it's not in the least out of fear of the Duchess, if you're talking about the La Tremeuse. I assure you, everyone likes to visit her. I'm not saying she's profound. He pronounced profound as if it were a ridiculous word, because his language still bore the trace of habits of mind which his recent rejuvenation, marked by a love of music, had temporarily made him lose, so that at times he now expressed his opinions warmly. But I'm quite sincere when I say she's intelligent and her husband is well-read. They're charming people. Whereupon Madame Verdurin, feeling that because of this one infidel she would be prevented from creating a complete moral unanimity among the little clan, was unable to stop herself in her rage against this stubborn man who did not see how much his words pained her, from crying out to him from the bottom of her heart, Believe it, if you like, but at least don't say it to us. It all depends on what you call intelligence, said Forcheville, who felt it was his turn to shine. Now, Swann, what do you mean by intelligence? There you are, exclaimed Odette. That's sort of the big subject I'm always asking him to talk to me about, but he never will. But I do, protested Swann. What tripe? Said Odette. Tripe with onions? Asked the doctor. As you see it, Forcheville went on. Does intelligence mean a gift of the gab? Does it have to do with how people manage to worm their way in? Finish up so they can take your plate, said Madame Verdurin sourly, turning to Seignette, who, absorbed in thought, had stopped eating, and perhaps a little ashamed of the tone she had taken. Never mind, take your time. I only said it for the sake of the others, because it holds up the next course. There is, said Bruchot, rapping out the syllables, a very curious definition of intelligence that in that gentle anarchist, Fenelon. Listen, said Madame Verdurin to Forcheville and the doctor. He's going to give us Fenelon's definition of intelligence. Now that's interesting. It's not often you have a chance of hearing that. But Brichot was waiting for Swann to give his own definition. Swann did not answer, and by evading them, spoiled the brilliant contest that Madame Verdurin was so delighted to be able to offer to Forcheville. Of course, he's just like that with me all the time, said Odette sulkily. I'm glad to see I'm not the only one he doesn't think is up to his level. Those de la Tremoise, who are so little to be recommended, as Madame Verdurin has shown us, asked Brichot with powerfully clear articulation. Are they descended from the folk whom Madame du Sévigné, that good snob, admitted she was pleased to know because it was good for her peasants? Of course, the Marquis had another reason, and one that had to be more important to her, for as a woman of letters, through and through, she put copy before all else. Now, in the journal she used to send regularly to her daughter, it was Madame de la Trémouille, kept well informed by her great connections, who supplied foreign politics. Why, no, I don't think it's the same family, ventured Madame Verdurin. Saniette, who, after hurriedly giving the butler his plate, which was presently still full, had plunged back into a meditative silence, emerging from it at last to tell him with a smile the story of a dinner he had attended with the Duc de la Trémouille. Trémouille. We'll say it like that. I'm very, very sorry. With the Duc de la Trémouille. At which it turned out that the Duke did not know George Sand was the pseudonym of a woman. Swann, who was very fond of Saniette, thought he ought to supply him with a few particulars about the Duke's culture, proving that such ignorance on the latter's part was materially impossible. But suddenly he stopped, realizing that Saniette did not need these proofs and knew the story was untrue for the simple reason that he had just invented it a moment ago. That excellent man suffered from being thought such a bore by the Verdurins, and aware that he had been even duller than usual at this dinner, he had not wanted to let it end before he succeeded in amusing them. He capitulated so quickly, looked so unhappy at seeing the effect on which he had counted had failed, and answered Swann in such a pitiful tone, so that Swann would not persist in a refutation that was henceforth pointless. All right. And if I'm mistaken, it's not a crime, I hope. That Swann would have liked to be able to say the story was true and delightful. The doctor, who had been listening to them, thought this was the very moment to say, "Sinon le verrou." But he was not quite sure of the words and was afraid of getting muddled. After dinner, Forcheville went up to the doctor. "She must not have been too bad at one time, Madame Verdurin, and she's a woman you can talk to. For me, that's everything. Of course, she's beginning to get a bit long in the tooth. But Madame de Crécy, now there's a little woman who seems intelligent. Oh, yes, by God. You can see at a glance that she keeps her eyes peeled. We're talking about Madame de Crécy," he said to Monsieur Verdurin, who was approaching, his pipe in his mouth. "I would imagine that as a specimen of the female figure." "I'd rather have it in my bed than a slap with a wet fish," Cottard rushed to say, having waited in vain for some moment for Forcheville to pause for a breath so that he could insert an old joke, which he feared would not be appropriate again if the conversation changed course, which he delivered with that excess of spontaneity and assurance which attempts to mask the coldness and anxiety inseparable from a recitation. Forcheville was familiar with the joke. He understood it and was amused by it. As for Monsieur Verdurin, he was unsparing with his mirth because he had recently discovered a signal for expressing it different from the one used by his wife, but equally clear and simple. Scarcely had he begun to move his head and shoulders in the manner of a person shaking with laughter than he would immediately begin coughing, as if, in laughing too hard, he had swallowed smoke from his pipe. And still keeping the pipe in one corner of his mouth, he would prolong indefinitely this pantomime of suffocation and hilarity. Thus he and Madame Verdurin, who across the room from him listening to the painter telling her a story. was closing her eyes before dropping her face into her hands, looking like two theater masks, each representing merriment in its own way. Monsieur Verdurin had in fact been wise not to withdraw his pipe from his mouth, for Cottard, who needed to leave the room for a moment, made a joke under his breath that he had learned recently, that he repeated each time he had to go to the same place. I must absent myself for a moment in aid of the Duc de Mual, so that Monsieur Verdurin's fit began again. Take your pipe out of your mouth. Can't you see you're going to choke to death trying not to laugh? Madame Verdurin said to him as she came around, offering the liqueur. How charming your husband is. He has enough wit for 4, declared Forcheville to Madame Cottard. Thank you, madame. An old soldier like me never refuses a drop. Monsieur de Forcheville thinks Odette is charming, said Monsieur Verdurin to his wife. Why, actually, she would like to come to lunch with you sometime. We're going to contrive to make it happen, but Swann mustn't hear of it. You know he puts rather a damper on things. That doesn't mean you shouldn't join us for dinner, of course. We hope to have you often. With summer coming, we'll be dining outdoors quite frequently. That won't bore you, will it? The little dinners in the bois? Good. It will be very nice. Aren't you going to go do your job now? She cried out to the little pianist, in order to display in front of a newcomer as important as Forcheville both her wit and tyrannical power over the faithful. Monsieur de Forcheville is saying bad things to me about you, said Madame Cottard to her husband when he returned to the drawing-room. And he, pursuing the idea of Forcheville's noble lineage, which had preoccupied him from the beginning of dinner, said to him, I am treating a baroness just now, Baron Putbus. The Putbuses took part in the Crusades, didn't they? They have a lake in Pomerania that's so big it must be 10 times the size of the palace of the Place de la Concorde. I'm treating her for rheumatoid arthritis. She's a charming woman. In fact, she knows Madame Verdurin, I believe. Which allowed Forcheville, finding himself a moment later alone with Madame Cottard, to complete the favorable judgment that he had passed on her husband. And he's so interesting. You can tell he's acquainted with more than a few people. Lord, they know a lot, these doctors. I'm going to play the phrase from the sonata for Monsieur Swann, said the pianist. My God, I trust we don't have the sonata snake in our midst, asked Monsieur de Forcheville to create an effect. But Dr. Cottard, who had never heard that pun, did not understand it and thought Monsieur de Forcheville was making a mistake. He went up to them briskly to correct it. No. One doesn't say serpent à sonnettes. It's serpent à sonnettes. Rattlesnake. He said it in a tone that was zealous, impatient, and triumphant. Forcheville explained the pun to him. The doctor blushed. Admit that it's funny, doctor. Oh, I've known it for too long, answered Cottard. But they fell silent under the agitation and of the violin tremolos, which protected it with their quivering extended 2 octaves above, as in a mountainous countryside, behind the apparent and vertiginous immobility of a waterfall one sees 200 feet down. The minuscule... Turn the page. The minuscule form of a woman walking, the little phrase had just appeared, distant, graceful, protected by the long unfurling of its transparent, ceaseless curtain of sound, and Swann in his heart appealed to it as a confidant of his love, as to a friend of Odette's, who certainly should tell her to pay no attention to that floor fill. That's page 274.